Blood welled at the corner of Perlita Colby's mouth, and Coyle Beaudry did not yet know that the debt he'd come to collect from her husband would cost him everything before sundown. The whole Long Branch Saloon had gone quiet enough to hear the coins in his fist, quiet enough that everyone in the room could hear the second blow coming before it landed, and not one man in that crowded room moved to stop it. Except one. In the far corner, under a slouch hat pulled low, a stranger who had been nursing the same cup of coffee for 3 nights running finally set that cup down on the bar, slow and deliberate, and reached up to unfasten the poncho he'd worn since the day he rode into Dodge City. Because Coyle Beaudry had just struck a woman for the second time in front of a room full of witnesses, and the man in the corner had ridden 400 miles to make sure there was never a third. Spring of 1873. Dodge City, out on the Kansas frontier when the cattle season hadn't yet arrived to fill Front Street with noise and money, and a town that size still ran mostly on whoever held the paper on everybody else's debts. If you have ever watched a good woman get ground down by a man who never once had to answer for anything in his life, and wondered what it would take for somebody, anybody, to finally step between them, stay with me tonight, because I promise you this story earns its ending, even if it costs plenty to get there. Now let's go back, a little ways back before that second slap, back to a widow named Perlita Colby who was only trying to hold on to 80 acres her husband died for. Perlita had come north from the brush country below the Nueces River 4 years before a 19-year-old bride answering a letter that had traveled 600 miles to find her, written in a careful, patient hand by a Kansas homesteader named Emmett Colby. She remembered the letter, word for word even now, how he'd written that he wasn't a rich man and never expected to be one, that his cabin had a leaking roof and a stubborn well, but that he had 80 acres of good bottomland along a dry fork of the Arkansas. If a woman, brave enough to travel that far, might consider building a life alongside him. Her own father, a widowed vaquero who broke horses for wages on a ranch outside Corpus Christi, had looked at that letter a long while before he finally nodded and told her that a man's handwriting told you plenty about the shape of his patience, and that this one's patience ran deep. She had not been wrong to trust her father's read of the man. Emmett Colby met her stage in Dodge City, with his hat already off, before she'd even climbed all the way down, and he did not so much as raise his voice to her in the 4 years that followed, not once. Not even the winter, the well finally gave out, and they hauled water by hand for 6 straight weeks. He taught her the names of the birds that wintered along the fork. He learned, slow and clumsy, and without a trace of embarrassment, the handful of Spanish words she still said things in when she was tired or frightened or half asleep. And he used them back to her, sometimes just to see her smile. They built a life the way most homestead couples built a life on that stretch of prairie. A little at a time, one hard season folded into the next. A barn raised with borrowed hands and repaid labor, a garden that mostly survived the grasshopper years. It ended on an ordinary Tuesday, in the dead of the previous winter, the way these things so often do, without any warning worth the name. Emmett had gone into town to trade at the mercantile, and never made it home. A freight wagon skidded on ice coming down the grade above Duck Creek, and Emmett, walking his own horse careful along the same stretch, was caught between the wagon and the bluff wall when the team spooked. He lived 2 days after that, long enough for Perlita to sit with him and hold his hand and hear him tell her, over and over in a voice going thinner each hour, that the land was hers, now free and clear, and that she was not, under any circumstance, to let anybody talk her out of it. Then he was gone, and Perlita Colby was 22 years old and a widow on the Kansas frontier with 80 acres, a half-empty root cellar, and a debt she did not yet know existed. She learned about the debt 3 weeks after the burying, when a rider came out from town, carrying a folded letter from the Ford County Bank, informing her, in language dressed up polite enough to disguise exactly how ugly it was, that her late husband had borrowed $60 to cover seed and a doctor's bill for a fever that had gone through half the county that year, and that the note was now due in full with the customary interest, and that the bank's president, a Mr. Coyle Beaudry, would be obliged if she called on him at her earliest convenience to arrange satisfactory terms. Coyle Beaudry did not look at first glance like a man who owned half the paper in Ford County. He was 51 years old, thick around the middle in the well-fed way of a man who had never once gone hungry, with small pale eyes set close together over a mustache. He kept waxed to a fine point and a habit of smiling with his mouth, while his eyes stayed flat and calculating underneath it. Like a poker player counting a hand, he'd already decided to win regardless of the cards. He had come to Kansas 9 years back with money made off a played-out silver claim called the Solomon Peak up in the Colorado Rockies, sold at the top of a boom to a fool who never got a dollar back out of it, and he had spent every year since turning that first stroke of luck into something closer to a small empire. A half interest in the freight line running south to the territory, the deeds to more than 40 homestead claims he had helped struggling families through hard winters, and, not least of it, more than enough friends among the town council and the county sheriff's office that nobody in Dodge City had cause to remember him as a man who had gotten rich, mostly off other people's bad luck. He still called himself, when it suited him, the Mine Baron, a title he'd earned honestly enough back in Colorado and had never once let anybody forget, because it lent him a kind of frontier respectability that a plain banker or a plain moneylender. Men who owed him money learned quickly that Coyle Beaudry did not raise his voice and did not need to. He simply made sure, in his quiet, patient, unhurried way, that everyone in town understood exactly whose good graces they were currently living inside of, and exactly how easily those graces. Perlita went to see him at the bank the week after the letter arrived, dressed in her one good black mourning dress, and she offered him what she had, which was $11 in coin and a promise of the rest by autumn. Beaudry had smiled at her the whole time she spoke, that flat waxed smile, and told her that $11 was a start, a fine start truly, but that a widow alone on 80 acres was a poor risk for a bank to carry through a whole growing season, and that perhaps they ought to discuss the matter further over supper sometime, just the two of them, where a man could speak more freely about what kind of consideration he had in mind. Perlita had stood up from her chair without another word, left the $11 on his desk, and walked out of that bank with her spine iron straight and her hands shaking so hard she had to sit down twice on the walk back to the wagon. She told no one what he'd said, not at first, because there was no one in Dodge City whose help would not somehow root straight back through Coyle Beaudry's good graces. The sheriff's own brother owed the bank on a house in town. Half the shopkeepers on Front Street carried notes with Beaudry's signature at the bottom. The one preacher in town had a habit of preaching forgiveness for men of means and patience for everybody else, and Perlita had learned by then, the hard way every widow on that frontier eventually learns it, that a community's silence is very rarely an accident and very often a debt of its own, owed by people who have simply decided it's cheaper to look away than to pay what looking directly would cost them. There had been exactly one man in Dodge City willing to say so out loud, a dry goods merchant named Ezra Voss, who had known Emmett Colby well enough to call him a friend, and who had told Beaudry plainly, across the counter of his own store, that hounding a grieving widow over $60, Beaudry had smiled at him, that same flat smile. And, inside of a month, Ezra Voss found his own note on the store, called due ahead of schedule, with a polite letter reminding him that the bank reserved the right to review any account showing signs of poor judgment. Voss had paid it, swallowing whatever pride the exercise cost him, and after that he still nodded kindly to Perlita whenever she came in for thread or coffee, but he never again said Beaudry's name above a murmur. A man with a family to feed learns the same arithmetic a widow learns, just from a different angle of the same trap. The one steady kindness she could still count on came from Dolores Whitfield, a widow herself 20 years further down that same hard road, who worked the claim adjoining Perlita's along the Dry Fork, and had buried a husband of her own to a Comanche raid back before the war ever got around to Kansas. Dolores had no money to spare and no particular standing in town, but she had time, and she gave it freely, riding over most Sundays with a jar of preserves or a length of mended cloth, sitting with Perlita on the porch step while the light went long and gold over the bottomland. Saying little of substance most visits because there was little that needed saying. Land outlasts the men who try to take it, Dolores told her once, working a knot out of a skein of yarn with fingers gone permanently crooked from 20 winters of frost, so long as the woman holding the deed outlasts them meaner. You will. I did. It was not much comfort against $60 and a banker's patient cruelty, but it was real, and on the frontier, real comfort, however small, was worth more than most folks ever gave it credit for. So, Perlita did what she could. She took in laundry and mending for the drovers, passing through, sold eggs and a little cream at the mercantile, and 3 nights a week she worked the floor at the Long Branch Saloon, pouring drinks and clearing tables for tips, careful and the way a woman learns to be when she has decided in advance exactly how far a smile is allowed to travel before she takes it back. She kept a small folding knife her father had given her tucked into her boot, more habit than expectation of trouble, and she counted every coin twice before she put it toward the note, watching the debt creep down with agonizing slowness while the interest Beaudry tacked on kept nearly pace with her payments. The way debt does when the man collecting it has no interest whatsoever in ever seeing it paid off. She rose most mornings before first light, milked the one cow Emmett had left her, walked the fence line out of habit more than necessity, because he had always walked it first thing, and she found some comfort in keeping the same worn path his boots had made, and whatever wage work she could carry home on a given afternoon. By the time she changed into her one presentable dress for the evening shift at the Long Branch, she had usually already put in what most men in Dodge City would have called a full day's labor, and she did the arithmetic of it most nights, walking home well past midnight under a sky gone hard and bright with prairie stars, tallying up exactly how far she still had to go before Coyle Beaudry's name stopped meaning anything at all in her life. Some nights the sum of it felt bearable. Other nights, especially after a shift where Beaudry himself had come in to drink with his men and watch her work the room with that flat, patient smile of his, she sat a long while on her own porch step afterward with her father's knife in her lap, not because she expected to use it, but because holding something solid in her hands made the fear a little easier to set down before sleep. If a few of you out there have ever felt like the whole system was quietly built to keep you owing something you can never quite finish paying, that's exactly the corner Perlita Colby had been backed into. If stories like hers keep you watching, consider becoming a channel member. Tap join beside the channel name. It's what keeps these stories coming. It was into that same saloon on a cold evening early that spring that a stranger rode in on a tired bay gelding and took a corner seat nobody else wanted, the one furthest from the lamplight with his back to the wall and both doors in plain sight. He wore a wide vaquero-style poncho, dust-colored and travel-worn. Over a plain shirt and a gun belt, he kept mostly hidden beneath it, and a slouch hat pulled low enough that most folks who glanced his way saw only shadow where a face should have been. He ordered coffee, not whiskey, and nursed it slow, the way a man nurses a drink when he isn't there to drink at all. He had ridden into Dodge City itself 4 days before that first evening at the Long Branch, arriving from the south along the same dusty stage road that had once carried Perlita's own coach into town, and his first act had not been to seek out the saloon at all, but simply to sit his tired gelding at the edge of Front Street for the better part of an hour, taking the measure of the place, the bank, with Beaudry's name freshly painted gold across its window, the freight office, the mercantile, the cluster of homes further out where a woman with 80 acres and a dead husband's promise might reasonably be found. He had taken a cheap room above the livery under a name that wasn't his, paid a week in advance in coin that raised no questions, and spent those first days listening more than talking, the careful, patient reconnaissance of a man who had survived a long while precisely by never walking into a room before he understood every door in it. It was an old drover at the livery, talkative and half in his cups even at midday, who first pointed him toward the Long Branch as the place a man went to hear the real business of Dodge City discussed. And it was that same drover, without ever knowing the weight of what he was saying, who mentioned offhand that the widow Colby worked the floor there 3 nights a week to make ends meet since Beaudry's bank had gotten its hooks into her land. Silas had bought the man a second drink for that piece of information and said nothing more about it, and by sundown he had found the corner seat he would keep for the next 3 weeks. He came back the next night, and the night after that, always the same corner. Always the same slow coffee, always watching. Nobody in the Long Branch knew his name. If they had asked around in the right saloons down along the border in Laredo or Brownsville or the rougher cantinas scattered through the brush country south of the Nueces, they might have heard a name whispered with real caution behind it, Silas, a name that had, in certain circles, gone quiet these last few years, the way a fire goes quiet when a man wants folks to stop looking for the smoke. There was a wanted notice for him still tacked to a courthouse wall or two down in Texas, faded and curling at the corners, offering $400 for a stagecoach robbery gone bad 8 years back, and the notice had his description close enough to trouble if anybody in Dodge had thought to study his face too carefully. Nobody did. A quiet stranger nursing coffee in a corner is to most people simply furniture, and Silas had learned a long time ago how to be furniture when furniture was what kept him breathing. He had not ridden 400 miles to be furniture forever, though. He had a reason for the corner, and a reason for the coffee, and a reason, most of all, for choosing that particular saloon on that particular stretch of Front Street, and it went back further than any wanted notice. Back to a river crossing during the war that neither Silas nor a young cavalry trooper named Emmett Colby had ever managed to fully leave behind them. Twice in those first 2 weeks, he had come close to simply crossing the room and introducing himself to her plainly, telling her who he'd been to Emmett and what he'd come to do, and twice he had lost his nerve at the last moment. Some old caution rising up in him that a man wanted on a Texas courthouse wall learns to trust more than his own better instincts. The truth, sitting uneasy in his chest through most of that vigil, was that he did not yet know how to explain himself to a grieving widow, without the whole account sounding either like a lie too convenient to believe, or a confession too damning to trust. Watching Beaudry's shadow lengthen a little further over her each week, promising himself he would speak plainly the very next night, and then not doing it, until the choice was finally taken out of his hands entirely by the sound of Beaudry's palm connecting with her cheek. They had served together for the better part of 2 years, Silas and Emmett, riding as scouts, attached to the same irregular company operating along the Texas border, 2 boys, barely 20, who had learned to trust each other with the kind of trust that only gets built by men who have watched the same friends die and kept riding regardless. In the last hard winter of the war, their company had been caught crossing the Nueces River at night, under fire, from a Union patrol that had gotten better information than anyone expected. And in the chaos of that crossing, with the current running high and cold and half the company scattered along both banks, Emmett Colby had gone into the water after Silas, when Silas's horse went down under him and the current started dragging him toward a logjam that would have finished him for good. Emmett got a rope on him. Emmett hauled him out onto the south bank half-drowned and half-frozen, and while they lay there catching their breath, under a sky still lit up with rifle fire, Silas had made Emmett a promise, the kind of promise young men make in the dark when they've just watched death come that close and go past, that if anything ever happened to Emmett, if the war or the years afterward ever left people behind that Emmett couldn't protect anymore himself, Silas would find them, and he would stand in the gap. The war ended not long after, the way wars end, badly and all at once, and both young men had gone home to nothing much. No money, no prospects, a country still working out how to feed men it no longer needed as soldiers. Emmett had drifted north eventually, chasing a homestead claim, and, later, Perlita's letter. Silas had drifted the other direction, down toward the border country, and there, hungry and directionless in a way that made a man dangerous to himself, he had fallen in with a rougher outfit running freight and occasionally relieving other outfits of theirs at gunpoint and the man who'd recruited him into that life. The man who taught him how a stagecoach robbery was properly planned and properly split had been a sharp-eyed young opportunist working his way up from nothing, going by the name of Coyle Beaudry. They had ridden together the better part of 2 years, Silas and Beaudry, 4 robberies clean and a 5th one that went bad, in exactly the way the wanted notice remembered it. A stagecoach outside Del Rio, a guard who fought back harder than anybody planned for, 2 men dead on the road, and Silas taking a bullet through the shoulder in the scramble to get clear. Beaudry had ridden off with the strongbox and left Silas bleeding in the brush, telling the others afterward, once they'd regrouped a day's ride south, that Silas hadn't made the rendezvous and was likely dead or captured. It was a convenient story. It let Beaudry keep the full split instead of a half share, and it let him ride north not long after, with a stake nobody else in the gang knew the true size. Of the same stake that eventually bought him a claim called the Solomon Peak. Silas had not died in that brush. A vaquero family working a small spread nearby, an old man named Refugio Silas, and his 2 grown sons had found him half-conscious under a mesquite 2 days after the robbery, more dead than alive, and had carried him back to their jacal and nursed him through the fever that followed. Unhesitating kindness, Perlita's own father had shown to strangers his whole life along that same stretch of border country. Refugio never once asked him what business had left 3 bullet wounds in a man's shoulder and side, and Silas, delirious through most of the worst of it, had nonetheless understood, even then, that he was being given something he had done nothing to earn, and it had changed the shape of something in him that the war itself had failed to reach. He stayed with the Silas family the better part of 5 months, working what he could of their small herd once he was strong enough to sit a horse, learning their Spanish and their patience and, eventually, their particular unhurried way of judging a man by his hands and his word rather than. By the time Silas was strong enough to ride on, Coyle Beaudry was 3 states away, and the wanted notice for the Del Rio robbery carried Silas's description alone, since he was the only one of the gang. And the strongbox money had long since scattered into whatever ledger entries Beaudry needed it to become. Silas had spent the 8 years since drifting north and west in slow loops, taking honest work where honest work would have a man with his description hanging over him. Breaking horses, running freight, one hard winter scouting for an army supply column that never once asked to see his papers, and carrying, the whole while, a debt of his own building quietly in the back of his mind, not a debt of money, but the older kind, the kind a man carries when somebody he trusted left him for dead, and rode off richer for it. It was a trail hand passing through a border town the previous autumn who had finally connected the pieces for him, mentioning over cards, careless the way men are careless with names that mean nothing to them, that the big mine baron up in Dodge City, Kansas, Coyle Beaudry, ran the bank there now, if you could believe it. Had just about run a widow woman clean off her land over some little debt her husband left behind. The trail hand hadn't caught the widow's name. He hadn't needed to. Silas had sat very still at that card table for a long moment, and then he had folded his hand, settled his tab, and started riding north the next morning, because there was exactly one debt from that stretch of his life he had never stopped intending to collect, and exactly one promise he had never stopped intending to keep, and it had just occurred to him, with a cold certainty that felt almost like relief after 8 years of not knowing what to do with it, that both of them might belong to the same man. He found Perlita's name easy enough once he reached Dodge City, and found the Long Branch Saloon easier still, and once he saw her, the way she moved through that room with a tray balanced on one hip and a professional smile that cost her nothing and gave nothing away, the way she flinched, just barely, every time Beaudry's name came up at the tables around her. He did not need a formal introduction to know he had found Emmett Colby's widow. What he did not yet know, that first night, was how quickly this was going to come to a head, or how publicly. The trouble that finally broke open at the Long Branch had been building all that week, ever since Beaudry had cornered Perlita outside Ezra Voss's store on the Monday, blocking her path on the boardwalk with the easy, unhurried menace of a man who had never once had to worry about being refused. He had told her then, quiet enough that only she and Voss, watching uneasily from behind his own counter, could hear it clearly, that his patience with the note was about spent, and that she would do well to consider his nephew Garrett's offer of marriage before he was forced to consider other remedies the bank's charter allowed him. Perlita had said nothing, only stepped around him and walked on, but she had gone home that evening and sat a long while on her porch step with her father's old folding knife turning over and over in her hands, understanding without being told exactly what shape other remedies was likely to take. And understanding, too, that a woman alone on 80 acres had precious few places left to carry that fear where it might do her any good. It came to a head on a Thursday evening 3 weeks into Silas's quiet vigil, when Coyle Beaudry walked into the Long Branch with 2 of his hired men flanking him, and a look on his face that told half the room something ugly was coming before he'd said a single word. He found Perlita clearing glasses near the piano and planted himself directly in her path, close enough that she had to stop or walk into him. $22 is what's owed on the note this quarter, Mrs. Colby, and I've come to collect it in person, seeing as how you've missed the last 2 payments. He said, it loud-pitched, to carry the way a man speaks when the audience matters more to him than the woman he's actually addressing. I have $8, Mr. Beaudry, and I'll have the rest, inside 2 weeks, once the eggs sell and the mending money comes in. She kept her voice level, kept her chin up, though her hands had gone tight around the tray she was holding. 2 weeks. Beaudry made a show of considering it, glancing around at the crowded room, gathering his witnesses. I've been considerate a long while now, Mrs. Colby. Considerate enough that some men in this town have started asking me why I let a widow run so far behind on paper her own husband signed. Man's got a reputation to think of. My husband's debt was $60 8 months ago. I've paid near 40 of it already, and every payment I bring you seems to shrink less than it ought to. Interest is interest, it ain't personal. He smiled that flat smile at her, and then, without any real change of tone, as though he were commenting on the weather, he reached out and closed his hand around her wrist, hard enough that she gasped and the tray tipped, 3 glasses shattering against the floorboards. Maybe it's past time we settled this a different way. My nephew Garrett's looking for a wife who knows hard work. A woman in your position ought to think practical about an offer like that, instead of standing here arguing sums with the man holding your paper. Let go of me. Something in her voice went flat and cold, the particular flatness of a woman who has just understood exactly how far a man intends to push, and Beaudry, irritated at being refused in front of an audience he'd gathered specifically to watch her yield, tightened his grip instead of loosening it, and when she twisted free of his hand and stumbled back a step, he closed the distance in 2 strides and struck her an open-handed blow across the face that snapped her head sideways and dropped her half against the piano, a thin line of blood springing at the corner of her mouth. The fiddle music died. Every conversation in the Long Branch fell away into that particular held-breath silence of a room full of people calculating, each of them privately, exactly how much trouble it would cost them to be the one who spoke up. Nobody moved. The bartender studied a glass he was pretending to clean. Beaudry's 2 hired men shifted their weight, ready, watching the room for any objection worth putting down hard. Get up. Beaudry's voice had dropped low, now dangerous. In a way, loud men rarely manage. Get up, and you tell this room whether you're paying that note in full inside the week, or whether you're marrying my nephew, because I am done being patient with a woman who thinks a dead husband's promises are somebody else's problem to keep chasing. Perlita pushed herself up off the piano bench, blood at her mouth, hands shaking, and looked him dead in the eye. I will bury myself on that 80 acres before I marry into your family, Mr. Beaudry. Somewhere near the back of the room, Ezra Voss half rose from his chair, some flicker of the loyalty he'd once shown Emmett Colby fighting its way up, past 8 months of learned caution, and got as far as saying, "Now, Coyle, there's no cause," before one of Beaudry's hired men turned a flat warning look on him, and Voss sat back down, slow. His face burning with a shame he would carry a long while. Another small piece of the town's collective silence, quietly reasserting itself, even as it visibly cost him something to let it. It was by every account anybody in that saloon gave afterward, the single bravest and single most dangerous thing anyone had said to Coyle Beaudry in 9 years, and Beaudry's face went from irritated to something considerably uglier as the room's silent audience absorbed exactly how thoroughly she had just refused him in public. He drew his hand back a second time. In the corner, a cup of coffee touched down on the bar top, quiet, deliberate, final. Silas came up off his stool the way a man comes up who has spent his whole life learning to move without announcing it, unhurried, unbothered by the eyes that swung toward him, and reached up with both hands to unfasten the poncho he had not once taken off in 3 weeks of watching that room. It slid from his shoulders and pooled on the floor behind him, and what it had been hiding drew a low murmur from the crowd, a gun belt worn low and easy on each hip, the leather dark and cared for in the particular way that told anyone who knew guns exactly how much use it had seen. Weathered and scarred faint along one cheekbone, eyes the flat, patient gray of a man who had made peace a long time ago, with whatever it cost him to do what came next. That's enough, Beaudry. 2 words, quiet, and they landed in that silent room like a dropped glass. Beaudry's hand froze mid-swing. His 2 hired men turned toward the corner with their hands drifting instinctively toward their own holsters, and then went very still because something about the stranger's stance, the easy, unhurried readiness of it, told them plainly that reaching any further, "This is a private matter, mister, and none of your concern." Beaudry recovered his composure fast, the way men of his sort always do, folding his surprise back into contempt. "Whoever you are, I'd suggest you finish your coffee and mind your own business. I minded it a long while already. 8 years, give or take." Silas crossed the room slow, unhurried, each boot fall deliberate on the floorboards, and stopped an arm's length from Beaudry, close enough that only the front rows of the crowd could hear what came next, though word of it would travel through Dodge City by morning regardless. "You don't recognize me, do you, Coyle? That's fair. Last time you saw me, I was bleeding out in the brush south of Del Rio, and you'd already decided I was somebody else's problem." Something shifted in Beaudry's face, a flicker of genuine alarm working its way up through the practiced contempt, and his eyes went to the man's face properly for the first time, taking in the scar, the eyes, some old memory surfacing slow and unwelcome. "That's not possible. You're dead." You heard what you told the others to keep from riding back and checking. Easier that way. Easier to split a strongbox 2 ways with a dead man than 5 ways with a live one." Silas kept his voice level, almost conversational, and that was somehow worse than shouting would have been, the calm of a debt finally being called due after too many years accruing interest of its own kind. "I've thought about you a good deal since then, Coyle. Wondered what a man does with a stolen fortune when he's got nobody left to answer to for how he got it. Turns out he moves to Kansas, buys himself a bank, and starts running the same trick on widows that he used to run on stagecoach guards. Take what ain't his and leave the ones who might object bleeding somewhere." He let that settle a moment before he went on. The crowd had drawn in tighter now, nobody breathing much, every eye in the Long Branch fixed on the 2 men standing close enough to touch. Beaudry's hired men still hadn't moved, caught between orders they hadn't been given and a threat they hadn't been trained to handle. Whatever grudge you're nursing, it's got nothing to do with this woman." Beaudry tried for authority, and mostly found bluster instead. "This is a debt matter between me and Mrs. Colby, plain and legal, and you've got no standing. I've got exactly the standing I came 400 miles to claim." Silas's eyes didn't leave Beaudry's face. Her husband was Emmett Colby. "I served with Emmett 2 years down along the border during the war, and one hard night crossing the Nueces River, he went into that current after me when I ought to have drowned, and hauled me out with his own 2 hands. I promised him that night that if anything ever happened to him, I'd find whoever he left behind, and I'd stand in the gap for them. I didn't know, riding up here, that the man who'd left his widow bleeding on a saloon floor would turn out to be the same man who left me bleeding in a ditch 8 years back. Strikes me now like the kind of coincidence that isn't really a coincidence at all. More like the same rot, showing up twice in one life, waiting on the same man to finally answer for it." He turned unhurried and walked to the saloon's front door and threw the bolt across it with a sound that carried through the whole silent room, a single hard click that told every soul inside the Long Branch that whatever was about to happen here was going to happen in front of all of them. Nobody's leaving till this gets settled proper, and nobody's fetching your bought sheriff either, Coyle, because he can hear the rest of it same as everyone here. Silas turned back to face him. "You're going to tell this room what happened outside Del Rio 8 years ago. Then you're going to tell them where the Solomon Peak steak truly came from. And then you're going to tear up whatever's left of Mrs. Colby's note, in front of every witness in this saloon, because a debt built on stolen money was never yours to collect in the first place." Beaudry's hand had drifted slow and careful toward the pistol under his coat, while Silas talked. The practiced motion of a man who had survived plenty of tense rooms by moving first, when nobody expected him to, and one of his hired men, catching the signal, started to shift his own weight toward a draw. It cost Beaudry exactly as long as it took him to clear the coat before Silas's own hand moved, faster than anybody watching quite managed to track, and the shot that followed took the pistol clean out of Beaudry's grip in a spray of splinters off the bar behind him, leaving him staring down at a hand gone numb and bloodless, more shocked than hurt. Second man who reaches for iron in this room doesn't get off that easy. Silas hadn't so much as raised his voice, the pistol in his hand, steady on Beaudry's chest now, and the 2 hired men weighing $400 in wages against the very real math of a man who had just drawn and fired faster than either of them had finished thinking about it. "You can't do this." Beaudry's voice had gone thin, the bluster finally cracking. "There's law in this town. There was law in this town the day you had a guard shot dead outside Del Rio and let another man take the blame for your whole outfit's crime. Funny how quiet you kept about law then." Silas nodded toward the marshal's badge visible through the front window across the street, where a small crowd had already begun gathering at the sound of the shot, drawn by curiosity and the particular electricity of a town realizing something long overdue was finally happening in public. "Your marshal's on his way now, and he can hear the truth, same as this room can, or he can hear it read off a federal warrant once I send word south to Del Rio that the man who's been paying his salary these 9 years is the same man wanted for a stagecoach murder. Your choice, Coyle. But either way, this room hears the truth tonight. It came out of him after that in ragged pieces, the way a confession does, when a man realizes the room has already decided the outcome, and all that's left to negotiate is how much dignity he gets to keep on the way down. He named the robbery outside Del Rio, low and reluctant, and the guard who had died in the crossfire, a young man named Purcell, who Beaudry admitted, prompted by a long silence from Silas that the whole room felt the weight of, had a widow and 2 children of his own down along the border who had never once been sent $1 of restitution. He admitted the decision to leave Silas in the brush rather than risk splitting the strongbox 5 ways instead of 4, admitted it had been a calculation and not a mistake, the words coming out of him smaller and uglier each time Silas made him repeat some fresh piece of it. He admitted the Solomon Peak claim had been salted with barely enough silver to fool one greedy buyer, and had never produced another ounce worth mining after, and that every dollar of the empire he'd built in Ford County traced back, in one crooked line or another, to that single stolen strongbox. Worst of all, prompted twice by Silas's steady, patient silence, and once by a sharp question from Dolores Whitfield herself, who had pushed her way to the front of the crowd the moment word reached her claim, Beaudry admitted that Emmett Colby's note had been called due faster and harder than any other debt on the bank's books that quarter. Not out of business necessity, but because he had taken a particular interest, from the very week of Emmett's funeral, in a young widow with nowhere else to turn and no husband left to stand between them. The marshal arrived part way through it, tried the bolted door, and was let in only once Silas had confirmed, through the window, that he intended no further violence, provided the truth kept getting told. The marshal, a heavy-set, tired man named Whitcomb, who had held the office 6 years and had spent most of them looking the other way where Beaudry's business was concerned, listened to the whole account with a face going grayer by the minute, understanding exactly how much of his own quiet complicity was about to become common knowledge in Dodge City. And, when it was finished, he did not so much arrest Coyle Beaudry as simply place a hand on his shoulder and say in a voice that carried its own particular shame, that they had best get on to the jail before the rest of the town heard it second-hand. By the time it was finished, Coyle Beaudry stood in the middle of the Long Branch Saloon, a considerably smaller man than he'd been an hour before, his hired men disarmed and sitting under guard near the door, his own hand wrapped in a bar rag someone had finally thought to offer him, along with every ledger page bearing her husband's signature, torn clean through and dropped at her feet at Silas's quiet insistence. Because a debt built on stolen money, he told the room again, plainly had never belonged to Coyle Beaudry to collect from anybody. Perlita had not moved from where she stood through most of it, one hand pressed to the healing cut at her mouth, watching a stranger she had exchanged perhaps a dozen words with in 3 weeks unmake, methodically and without a wasted motion, the entire foundation. When it was over, when the marshal had finally taken Beaudry into custody to await the federal paperwork that would follow once word reached Del Rio, she crossed the room to where Silas stood, reholstering his pistol, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. You knew Emmett. It wasn't quite a question. 2 years down along the border, before either of us was old enough to know what we were riding into. Silas looked at her, steady, something careful and unpracticed in his expression. A man not used to being looked at gratefully. He pulled me out of the Nueces the night I ought to have drowned in it. I told him that night I'd stand in the gap for whoever he left behind, if it ever came to that. Took me 8 years and a fair bit of foolishness to make good on it. But I don't generally leave a promise unpaid, ma'am, even a slow one. He said it plain, and then let the quiet hold. A promise kept 8 years late is the kind of ending that keeps this channel going. If nights like this one are why you keep watching, become a channel member, tap join beside the channel name, and help keep these stories coming. The days that followed carried Dodge City through a slow, thorough reckoning of its own, the kind of reckoning a town undergoes once the one man everybody had quietly organized their fear around turns out to be considerably less untouchable than advertised. The federal marshal who eventually rode up from the territory to collect Coyle Beaudry on the old Del Rio warrant found no shortage of Ford County residents suddenly willing to speak plainly about foreclosed claims and inflated notes and years of careful, quiet intimidation, now that speaking plainly no longer carried the risk it once had. The Ford County Bank changed hands within the month, its new management, under some encouragement from the same federal marshal, taking a considerably more generous view of the handful of homestead notes still outstanding against families who had, it turned out, been paying interest on debts calculated with a very creative hand. Coyle Beaudry stood trial that autumn on the federal warrant carried up from Del Rio, once statements from the Long Branch and a formal deposition from Marshal Whitcomb had made their way south through the proper channels, and the court found little difficulty convicting a man whose own mouth had already confessed the whole of it in front of 40 witnesses. He was sentenced to a long stretch at the territorial prison, his interest in the Ford County Bank sold off under court order to cover what restitution could still be traced and paid, a portion of it finally reaching the widow of the guard named Purcell down along the border, 8 years overdue. Ezra Voss, once he understood there was nothing left to fear, spoke Beaudry's name at full volume from then on, usually while telling the story to any traveler who'd stand still long enough to hear it, embellishing it a little more generously with each telling in the way small-town stories tend to grow. Perlita kept her 80 acres free and clear, exactly the way Emmett had told her to on the last afternoon of his life, and word of what had happened at the Long Branch traveled far enough that by summer she had more offers of honest work and honest friendship in Dodge City. The particular kind of goodwill that arrives, a little late and a little sheepish, once a community finally admits to itself how long it let fear stand in for decency. She sold her eggs and her cream at a fair price, now kept a smaller garden and a larger sense of what her own two hands were capable of holding on to, and she planted that spring a stand of cottonwood saplings along the Dry Fork where Emmett had always meant to plant them, finally getting around to a promise of his own that circumstance had never let him keep. Dolores Whitfield still rode over most Sundays, though the visits had a lighter feel to them now, less like two women propping each other up against the same hard wind and more like two neighbors who simply enjoyed the company. And it was Dolores who first said out loud, laughing, that the whole county owed the widow Colby and her mysterious stranger a debt of its own for finally shaking loose 8 years of quiet rot in one long Thursday evening. Silas did not stay in Dodge City long. A man with an old wanted notice still curling on a courthouse wall down in Texas has limited comfort settling anywhere long enough for folks to start asking careful questions, even a man whose most recent public act had been unmasking one of the county's leading citizens. He rode out on a gray morning 10 days after the reckoning at the Long Branch, having spent those 10 days quietly helping repair the roof on Perlita's cabin and reset a fence line the winter had knocked crooked. Steady presence that asks nothing and gives what it can regardless. You could stay. Perlita said it plain, standing by his horse in the gray early light. No pretense left between them after everything the last 10 days had shown each other. Dodge City's got room for a man willing to work honest, whatever old paper's still following him. Maybe someday that's true, and maybe someday I come back and find out. Silas swung up into the saddle, looking down at her a long moment. something warmer than gratitude passing between them that neither one of them had quite the words for yet. "But I've got an old debt of my own still riding with me, ma'am, a name to clear, if clearing's even possible, and I won't bring that trouble down on 80 acres you fought this hard to keep. Emmett asked me to stand in the gap for you if it ever came to it. I mean to keep standing in it even from a distance until I've got a name worth offering a woman like you outright." He rode north out of Dodge City that morning with the promise, finally fully paid, and the debt to Coyle Beaudry settled in the one currency that mattered most, the truth spoken plainly in front of everyone who had once been too afraid to hear it. Perlita watched him go from the edge of Front Street until he was nothing but a small dark shape against the wide Kansas sky, and then she turned and walked back toward the 80 acres that were at long last entirely and unquestionably her own, carrying with her the particular kind of hope that comes only after a debt finally gets paid in full, the sense, hard-earned and unmistakable, that a life interrupted by loss and cruelty could still, given enough patience and enough people willing to stand in the gap for one another, find its way back to something worth building. And that partner is how a widow on the Kansas frontier kept the land her husband died for, and how a wanted man finally paid off a promise 8 years overdue, proof enough, I'd say, that the good in this world doesn't always announce itself loud,